Welcome to the Leading at the Next Level podcast with Dove Development Consulting, the show built to provide ongoing support for your leadership journey. Before we move into today's lesson, let's make sure we're on the same page. We've seen firsthand how much more is required to provide authentic leadership to a team than to simply manage based on the authority that comes with a title or a position. What we've learned through more than 50 combined years of leadership responsibility is that taking the extra steps to serve people and earn influence will always produce results that barking orders never will. And if you stick with us to the end of this episode, we'll share how you can get a complimentary trial to a resource we've built like nothing else you've ever seen. With that in mind, let's get to work. We're going to continue down the path of looking at some profitability killers, and this time we're going to start with how the cost of poor communication impacts every single business. If we're really going to get serious, if we're going to dig into how we can capture our best return, and we're going to invest the energy into building that leadership culture that really does start at the top and it cascades throughout the entire organization, we should indeed have a pretty solid start at achieving some results we can really see, quantifiable results, if you will, as we address those profitability killers, the ones that we've already addressed in this series. And when we do that, we can expect to those steps should be able to really impact every other individual issue that's been eating away at that profitability throughout our organization. So the next one that we're going to look into right now, and it's one I think that deserves a ton of focus, because it also, like how it starts at the top and works its way down, I believe poor communication is one that can cost us in every other area that we'll look at after this lesson, as we move forward with all the other specific profitability killers we look at. So I think we can get more bang for our buck out of this as it relates to everything else that we do moving forward. So in the second lesson of our Emerging Leader Development course, for those of you that are alumni, if you will, that completed the course or have been through it, I share some stats from Salesforce.com and SIS International Research that really emphasize how significant the costs of poor communication really can be to an organization. Now, rather than going through all those here, and I'm going to reference one, the SIS one, several times later, but rather than doing it right now, I want you to consider how an article I found on the Society for Human Resource Management's website opened in making their case for what they called, the title of the article was called, A Business Rationale for Communications Competency. So it said that David Grossman reported in The Cost of Poor Communications that a survey of 400 companies with 100,000 employees each cited an average loss per company of $62.4 million per year because of inadequate communication to and between employees. Now, to be honest, even after, working nearly 20 years for a large manufacturing company, I still have a really, really tough time wrapping my head around a company that size, that 100,000 employees, because the company I worked for worldwide, we were somewhere between 10 and 15,000. So 100,000 is a huge company. I also have a hard time really capturing that number of loss, $62.4 million a year. It's just tough to comprehend. Now, thankfully, that opening paragraph that cited that, it also went on to provide an example that hit a little bit closer to home for me, and it cited it shared that a lady named Deborah Hamilton asserted in her article, Top 10 Email Blunders That Cost Companies Money, that miscommunications cost even smaller companies of 100 employees on average $420,000 per year. So again, that tied it back a lot closer to home, because in the last decade or so, a lot of the companies we've worked with locally really are in that 50, 100, 150, sometimes as many as 200 space rather than 100,000, right? So yet another article, as I'm digging into this and putting the research together, I'm pulling the stats and so on, I found on businesswire.com in early 22 or so, it referenced a study done by Grammarly and Harris Poll that dug into what they called the far-reaching impacts of poor workplace communication on U.S. businesses and employees. And that article estimated that up to a 1.2 trillion annual loss among businesses due to ineffective communication. Now, as I think back to a conversation I had on a Friday evening several years ago, 5, 6, 7 years ago at this point, about where a friend of mine told me, gosh, he didn't have time for all that touchy-feely stuff, that he was responsible for growing the business that he was the CEO of. I just can't imagine that he had any perspective whatsoever for losses his team was experiencing from communication alone. Quite frankly, they were about a 100-person company. So if those stats for average businesses hold true, then we could expect he'd be in that $420,000 range too. And I can't imagine he would have made that statement if he could have really put the dots together and had the understanding that, hey, we're probably losing $420,000 per year because of ineffective communication. Now, don't misunderstand me here. I also don't believe that he or any responsible executive for that matter would ever intentionally squander that kind of profit. But if poor communication truly is responsible for losses that large and that widespread, it would certainly serve to prove what Bernard Shaw suggested so many years ago when he said the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it's taken place. Now, to really grasp the significance of this profitability killer, we need to accept the reality that communication requires more than just saying a few words at a volume that somebody can hear. We need to make sure that our message is received and understood to have any hope of capturing even a little bit of what's so often lost. Now, with that in mind, let's look at why it's never as simple as just saying something once, especially if we need our team members to take action and get results. So one communication that I've seen kill profitability as much as any other thing ties directly back to that George Bernard Shaw comment that I just mentioned. And we can't assume that we've gotten our message across just because we shared it once. Now, I'm going to ask you, have you ever heard somebody say, I'm only going to say this one time? Here's a better question for you. That's probably going to require you to be a little bit more honest and transparent. How often have you said it? Now, I can assure you that I've made that statement just as much as anybody out there. And if you don't believe me, you're welcome to reach out. If you're on with us live, hit it up, go in a chat. Ask Cindy, reach out to our son. How many times has Wes said, I'm only going to say this once, and then had to repeat it over and over and over? What I'm sure I don't have to ask here is whether or not you believe this could ever be a realistic expectation. Now, if you have kids, or if you've ever even been around kids, you know that that's not a realistic expectation, that I'm only going to say it once, that's really going to happen. One of the most important lessons that I learned in all those years of behavior-based safety is that a 47-year-old, which again, today I am one, so we usually do things for the same reasons that a 7-year-old will. And I don't say that to belittle those of us that are 47 or even the 7-year-old for that matter, because sometimes a 7-year-old would be like, don't compare me to that crazy person. But I say it to emphasize that we all tend to act according to what's expected of us, and saying something once will rarely be sufficient, especially if we need a specific action taken based on that message that we're sharing. Now, in lessons 2 and lessons 4 of our emerging leader development course, we open, and it's very intentional that we open with these stats twice. We open sharing some statistics that John Maxwell shared on the very first page of his 2010 book, Everyone Communicates If You Connect. We talk about how we're bombarded. These are quotes that he shares. We're bombarded with 35,000 messages a day. And the second is most people speak about 16,000 words a day. Now, after sharing those two stats, I challenged the participants in our Emerging Leader Development course to really consider how much the first statistic about the 35,000 messages a day has increased since John wrote that book more than a decade ago. Then I asked them to consider what they're doing individually to make sure that the messages they need their teams to receive from them and take action on ever make it through all that noise that's coming at people on a daily basis. Now, a painful reality that compounds how much profitability poor communication can kill is that few organizations tie it directly to what they typically measure. Now, You've often heard me talk about my time in manufacturing and how we kept meticulous records of things like scrap and downtime and tooling replacement costs and really anything else that you can imagine. Now, if we ever worked through one of those things that I've often referenced called a 5 why analysis for any one of those things, I have no doubt that somebody would have misunderstood something somewhere along the line, that would have been one of those whys, a misunderstanding. But since that would have fallen into one of those touchy-feely categories, I'm not sure anybody would have really taken it seriously. But truth be told, I believe that the real reason would have been because they wouldn't have known how to do anything about it. They wouldn't have really had the tools at that point in time in that organization to change that communication so it was more effective, so we didn't have that loss to really eliminate it. Now, here's a quick story. If you've ever had one of God's chicken sandwiches, your thank you when you got it, whether it was through a drive-through or at the counter when we still went inside stores back in those days, right? Your thank you was acknowledged with my pleasure. And because that's just what we've come to expect at Chick-fil-A, it's really hard to imagine anything else. But it wasn't always that way. Our friend Jeff Henderson, when we were interacting with him a while back, he shared a story with us that really detailed how long it took Truett Cathy to make that cultural change from the traditional "you're welcome." Now, this wasn't something that Truett Cathy said once, like it was written on a stone tablet that he'd received on the mountaintop. It took him 10 years to make that change. Now, if we want to capture any of that profit that we lose to poor communication, we can't take the "I'm only going to say this once" approach. It's just not going to work. Even then, though, we're still going to need a lot of support from every single team member around us, every team member that we're interacting with, especially those leaders that we count on to really back us up and drive that culture with us, right? So when I learned that from Jeff, that it took 10 full years to make that change within Chick-fil-A, that a change that really, outside looking in, seemed like it was something fairly simple. When we hear that, I'm guessing you're tracking with me as to why we just can't expect to say something once and get our entire team to be on the same page with us right away. But that example, let's be honest, was tied to getting a whole bunch of people at all levels of a large organization in cities all across the country to change something that was probably a deeply ingrained habit. No wonder it took so long, right? It can't possibly be that hard to get our small teams to take action on something new, can it? So I'm going to challenge you here. Think back to, and I'll reference it, so in case it's not fresh in your head, think back to that statistic. I've referenced it earlier. I didn't really go into details, but that SIS International Research Study, it told us that the cumulative cost per year due to productivity losses resulting from communication barriers is more than $26,000 per employee. Not only that, the study found that a business with 100 employees, in this case, spends an average downtime of, hear this, 17 hours a week clarifying communications. This particular study said, translated into dollars, that's more than $530,000 a year. Okay, 17 hours a week, $530,000 a year. That's a big deal, right? When we covered this recently, not so long ago, in one of our public sessions where we offered our emerging leader development course, one of the participants was quick to raise his hand and say, time out. I think those numbers are low. He was a third shift supervisor at a local manufacturing plant, and most of his employees were some of the newest in the company because shift preference and so on and so forth. And he felt certain that his shift alone had that much downtime every single week as a result of poor communication. And I assure you, it was less than 100 people that on the team that he was responsible for. Now, before I go on, consider how much profitability that's killing, right? He had less than 100 people. I'm going to say he probably had 30-ish people in a shift. And if he felt like it was that much every single week on just that shift, imagine how much more it could be. Now, don't make the mistake of hanging all those numbers on his shoulders or even the entire management team in that facility. Poor communication is a profitability killer that has an impact at every level of leadership and everywhere else in an organization, right? It's not just at one level, it hits everywhere. Now, All too often, I hear the term individual contributor tied to the suggestion that as long as folks are lumped into this category, as long as the folks we're referring to as individual contributors, they're proficient in their technical skills required for the role, no other kind of development is necessary. And I'm going to tell you, I think that's crap. One of the, on just the most basic level, I'll challenge you to consider how many people you've ever seen in any organization that that you've been a part of or you've done business with who only perform their specific job and they never interact with another coworker. I'm going to tell you, I can't think of a single person that I've ever seen who would qualify. Although I can absolutely picture a few that have been much more suited for that because if something like that existed, because they just deal with people that poorly. Now, consider how frequently we need our team members who are at least somewhat competent in their technical roles, those individual contributors that we call them, right? How often we need them to, say, train new team members that are coming into organizations. And let's be honest, right? If they've mastered their jobs, poor communication shouldn't impact how effectively they train somebody, should it? And that couldn't possibly have anything to do with whether or not that new employee ever makes it through the orientation or the onboarding process. Wait a minute, maybe it does. And I promise you it absolutely does. And could that possibly be creating some of the downtime that the SIS International Research Study referenced? I would argue it probably is creating a lot of that downtime. Now, I'd also challenge you here to consider how these issues grow exponentially when, and I'm going to say when, not if, I'm stressing that, our team members butt heads. But that's likely beating the old dead horse, isn't it? You probably got the point here. Now, with some perspective in mind for just how much of a profitability killer poor communication is with our so-called individual contributors, is it safe to think similar issues don't exist at supervisory, manager, even executive levels? My goodness, I wouldn't take that bet. And that's exactly why poor communication is the second specific profitability killer that I wanted to address with you. I wanted us to be able to work through. And then moving forward, we're going to look at other profitability killers for sure, but I'm going to assure you that they're fed by poor communication. And we're going to make a case for why violating this thing that we've come to know as the golden rule could very well be one of the best things we can possibly do to address it, at least as it relates to communication.
Thanks for listening to the Leading at the Next Level podcast. Next time, we'll pick up where we left off by digging into some areas of each business that are impacted by poor communication. If you'd like to go deeper into anything we've shared here, or you need continuing education credits for your professional credential, send us an email at admin@dove-development.net. And we'll be happy to hook you up with a 45-day all-access trial to our complete Leading at the Next Level program at no cost. The full program includes access to well over 100 hours of digital lessons, complete with slides and action-based assessments to help you capture measurable bottom-line improvements in your organization, and 2 live lessons each month with Q&A so we can help you identify the specific action you want to take to lead your team more effectively.